The grinding crunch of metal against earth was the sweetest sound James Morgan had heard in months. From his porch, coffee mug in hand, he watched as Diane Halverson's gleaming white Range Rover sank into the carefully engineered trench he dug across his private access road the night before. The vehicle's front wheels had disappeared entirely, leaving the luxury SUV pitched at an angle that would make any mechanic wince. "What the hell?" Diane's shrill voice pierced the peaceful morning air as she flung her driver's door open. Her perfectly highlighted blonde bob remained unnaturally still despite her violent exit from the vehicle. "Morgan, I know you did this on purpose." James took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. "Morning, Diane. Seems like you found yourself in quite a situation there." The 40-foot trench, now serving its exact intended purpose, separated the public road from James' 80-acre ranch property, a property that technically fell outside the jurisdiction of Diane's precious Saddleback Estates Homeowners Association, despite her repeated claims to the contrary. Diane's face reddened as she stomped toward him in her designer heels, somehow navigating the rocky terrain with practiced ease. As HOA president, she had perfected the art of the intimidating approach over her 8-year reign of neighborhood terror. "This is deliberate sabotage. I was simply taking the most direct route to inspect the condition of the fence line where your property meets the development. As HOA president, it's my responsibility to trespass on clearly marked private property." James interrupted. "That sign you drove past says private road, no trespassing. It's been there for 3 years. This is the 11th time you've ignored it this month." Diane's eyes narrowed. "The HOA covenant clearly states." "Doesn't apply to my property," James cut in again. "We've been through this with your lawyer, my lawyer, and the county assessor. Twice." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the arrival of Sheriff Dawson's patrol car, its tires crunching slowly over the gravel road. The sheriff, a weathered man with 30 years of local dispute mediation under his belt, didn't even try to hide his smile as he surveyed the scene. "Got yourself in a predicament, Miss Halverson?" the sheriff asked, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. "This man deliberately sabotaged the road." Diane pointed an accusatory finger at James. "I want him arrested for destruction of property and reckless endangerment." Sheriff Dawson pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Now correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this Mr. Morgan's private road? The one you were specifically warned about using last month?" The color drained from Diane's face. "I was conducting official HOA business on property that isn't part of your HOA," the sheriff reminded her gently. "And according to my notes from our last conversation, you were explicitly informed that Mr. Morgan has every right to modify his private road as he sees fit." James couldn't help but notice how Diane's perfect posture faltered slightly, but true to form, she recovered quickly, straightening her designer blazer. "This isn't over, Morgan," she kissed under her breath before turning her attention to arranging a tow truck for her stranded luxury vehicle. James smiled into his coffee mug. He knew it wasn't over. With Diane Halverson, it was never over. But for the first time since she'd set her sights on absorbing his property into her kingdom, he felt like he might have the upper hand. The next morning, James woke to the sound of power tools. He squinted at his bedside clock, 6:15 a.m. Far too early for legitimate construction in the county, which had strict noise ordinances beginning at 8 o'clock a.m. He threw on a robe and stepped onto his porch to find a work crew erecting a large sign at the entrance to his property. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, marching down his driveway. The foreman, a burly man with a weathered face, handed him a document. "We've got all the permits, sir. Authorized by the county for a neighborhood notification sign." James scanned the paperwork, his blood pressure rising with each line. The permit had been rushed through approval yesterday afternoon, clearly pushed by someone with connections. The sign itself was enormous. "Note IC. Proposed in an exation of AJCN PROPRTUI into Saddleback Estates HOA jurisdiction. Public hearing CHULED." "This is impossible," James muttered. "There's no legal mechanism for forced annexation." As if summoned by his disbelief, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up beside the work crew. Diane stepped out, now dressed in an impeccable pantsuit despite the early hour. Her Range Rover had been replaced within 24 hours. This woman's resources were seemingly unlimited. "Good morning, James," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you don't mind the early start. The county was quite accommodating when I explained the public safety hazard your property represents." James held up the permit. "What annexation? You can't force my property into your HOA." "Actually, I believe we can," Diane replied smoothly. "Section 47 of the County Development Code allows for petition-based inclusion when a property creates demonstrable hazards to adjacent communities." She gestured toward where his trench had been. "Like hidden road modifications that might cause accidents for emergency vehicles." That's a private road on private property, and you know it. Diane's smile widened. The commissioner's office may see things differently at the hearing. We documented 12 instances where emergency access could have been compromised by your modifications. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. You deliberately drove into that trench. I have dashcam footage showing an unmarked hazard on what appears to be a normal access road, she countered, and signatures from 38 homeowners concerned about fire truck access should your property ever catch flame. The work crew finished mounting the sign, an enormous eyesore clearly designed to provoke him into doing something rash. Sheriff Dawson had warned him about Diane's tactics. She won by goading opponents into making mistakes. You've been trying to get my land for 3 years, James said evenly. What's this really about, Diane? For a brief moment, something genuine flashed in her eyes. Progress, James, your quaint little ranch is sitting on what should be phase 3 of our development. 30 luxury homes, a community pool, and a significant increase in property values for existing residents. She straightened an invisible wrinkle in her jacket. The HOA board has already approved preliminary plans. We just need your cooperation. So this is a land grab disguised as public safety, James concluded. I prefer to call it community improvement, Diane replied. The hearing is in 3 weeks. I suggest you consider your options carefully. Fighting this will be expensive, and my associates at the development company are prepared to be quite generous with the buyout offer. As she turned to leave, she paused. Oh, and James, I'd refrain from any more childish trenches. My new vehicle has excellent off-road capabilities. She patted the Mercedes affectionately. And the dashcam records 24/7. James watched her drive away, the massive sign now casting a shadow over his property. He'd underestimated her. The trench hadn't been a victory. It had been exactly what she needed to escalate this battle to the next level. He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. This was no longer about an annoying neighbor. This was war. She's using something called a health and safety variance to justify the annexation, James' attorney, Eleanor Simmons, explained over coffee in his kitchen 3 days later. It's rarely invoked, but technically legal if she can prove your property poses a hazard to the surrounding community. James pushed a stack of documents across the table. I've owned this land for 15 years. My grandfather owned it for 40 years before that. We've never been a hazard to anyone. Eleanor reviewed the hearing notice with practiced eyes. This isn't really about safety, James. According to my research, Saddleback Estates is developed by Westlake Partners. Guess who sits on their board of directors? Diane, James replied without hesitation. And her husband, Eleanor added. They stand to make millions if they can acquire your land for phase 3. This is about money, not neighborhood rules. James gazed out his kitchen window at the rolling pastures that had been in his family for generations. So what's our play here? Eleanor pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in notes. We need to undermine their safety argument while building community support. Diane's strength is in making this look like one stubborn rancher against the greater good of the community. We need to flip that narrative. The sound of vehicles crunching up his driveway interrupted their strategy session. James stepped onto his porch to find 3 SUVs parked at the edge of his property. A team of people in business attire was taking photographs and measurements near where his trench had been filled in. What now? He muttered, striding toward them with Eleanor close behind. A woman with a clipboard approached. Mr. Morgan, I'm Sandra Chen from the County Planning Office. We're conducting the preliminary safety assessment for the upcoming hearing. On whose authority? Eleanor interjected. Typically, these assessments require 72 hours' notice to the property owner. Sandra looked uncomfortable. We received special permission given the urgent nature of the safety concerns. There should have been a notice. There wasn't, James said flatly. I apologize for the oversight, Sandra replied, though her tone suggested this wasn't an accident. But since we're already here, perhaps you'd like to accompany us? Your input would be valuable. James exchanged glances with Eleanor, who gave a subtle nod. Fine. As they walked the property line, James noticed one particular man taking photos of areas far beyond any relevant safety concerns, his well, his barn, even the foundation of his house. When questioned, Sandra referred to comprehensive documentation protocols. They're building a case against you, Eleanor whispered as they fell a few steps behind the group, looking for any code violation they can find. James had maintained his property meticulously, but rural standards and HOA standards were worlds apart. What might be perfectly acceptable on a working ranch could be twisted into violations under suburban regulations. As the inspection team rounded the corner of his barn, James spotted a familiar black Mercedes parked just beyond his property line. Diane sat inside, watching the proceedings with smug satisfaction. She's not even trying to hide her involvement, James remarked. That's because she believes she's already won, Eleanor replied, but she's overlooked something important. What's that? People generally don't like bullies, Eleanor said with a small smile. And from what you've told me, there might be other homeowners who aren't thrilled with Diane's iron-fisted rule. James considered this. Tom and Sarah Jenkins, 3 doors down, fought with her for months over their garden shed. The Parkers had to repaint their entire house because Diane claimed the approved color they used didn't match the approved color on paper. Exactly, Eleanor nodded. We need to rally those people. Make this about more than just your property. If Diane can set this precedent for forced annexation, where does it stop? For the first time in days, James felt a glimmer of hope. I think I know where to start. The HOA meets tonight at the community center, and meetings are open to the public by law. Perfect, Eleanor said. Let's go introduce ourselves to your potential allies. As the inspection team finally departed, James caught Diane watching him. He offered a friendly wave that visibly unsettled her. She wasn't accustomed to seeing him confident after one of her power plays. Tonight, he would change the game. The Saddleback Estates Community Center was a testament to Diane's influence. A sprawling building with vaulted ceilings, expensive furniture, and professionally framed photos of neighborhood events prominently featuring Diane herself. James and Eleanor slipped into the back row just as the meeting was called to order. I call this meeting of the Saddleback Estates Homeowners Association to order, Diane announced from behind an elevated desk that resembled a judge's bench. 4 other board members flanked her, all looking equally self-important in business attire despite the casual neighborhood setting. James scanned the room. About 30 residents were scattered throughout the seating area, most looking bored or resigned. He recognized the Jenkins and the Parkers, along with several other homeowners who had run afoul of Diane's regime over the years. Before we begin with regular business, Diane continued, I'd like to address the exciting growth opportunity that's been presented to our community. As many of you have seen, there will be a county hearing regarding the potential inclusion of the adjacent Morgan property into our HOA jurisdiction. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several heads turned toward James, who kept his expression neutral. This expansion would allow for the completion of Phase 3, including 30 new luxury homes, a community swimming pool, and tennis courts, Diane said, her voice taking on the practiced enthusiasm of the sales pitch. Property values are projected to increase by 12 to 18%. A PowerPoint slide appeared on the wall behind her, showing a glossy rendering of a swimming pool complex. James noted that the image conveniently obscured the fact that his entire ranch would need to be bulldozed to accommodate it. Are there questions before we move to committee reports? Diane asked, clearly hoping to breeze past this topic. An older gentleman in the front row raised his hand. How much are our HOA dues going to increase to maintain these new amenities? Diane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The financial committee is still finalizing those projections, but any increase would be offset by your property value gains. So they will increase, the man pressed. Moving to committee reports, Diane said, ignoring him. Landscaping committee, you have the floor. James caught Eleanor's eye. This was the opening they needed. They had arrived with a plan, but watching Diane steamroll legitimate questions gave James a better idea. He raised his hand high. Diane studiously avoided looking in his direction as a woman detailed the new seasonal planning schedule. James kept his hand raised, unmoving. Other residents began to notice, then glanced between him and Diane with curious expressions. After the landscaping report concluded, James remained with his hand raised. The awkwardness in the room grew palpable. Finally, a board member leaned over to whisper something to Diane. She sighed dramatically. Yes, Mr. Morgan. You have a question? James stood. Not a question. According to HOA bylaws, Section 6.3, any member of the public is entitled to 3 minutes of floor time during open meetings when issues affecting adjacent properties are discussed. Diane's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched. You're not a member of this HOA. Not yet, James replied with a smile. But according to your annexation proposal, I soon will be, and this meeting is discussing issues directly affecting my property. Eleanor stood beside him, holding up a copy of the bylaws with the relevant section highlighted. The board members exchanged glances. 3 minutes, Diane conceded icily. The bylaws are quite specific. James moved to the front of the room. My name is James Morgan. My family has owned our ranch for 3 generations. Recently, Mrs. Halverson has initiated proceedings to force my property into this HOA against my will, using a rarely invoked safety variance. He paused, making eye contact with various homeowners. What you may not know is that this isn't about safety. It's about profit. Westlake Partners, the development company that would build Phase 3, stands to make millions from this land grab. Diane Halverson and her husband sit on their board of directors. Gasps and whispers erupted. Diane's face flushed bright red. That's a malicious falsehood, she snapped. Your time is up, Mr. Morgan. I still have 2 minutes according to the clock, James replied calmly, pointing to the wall timer. Furthermore, he continued, if this precedent for forced annexation succeeds, it puts every property bordering this development at risk. Today it's my ranch. Tomorrow it could be any land that Westlake Partners decides would be more profitable as part of Saddleback Estates. Several homeowners were now leaning forward intently. James could see the wheels turning as they processed the implications. James arrived at Riverside Cafe 15 minutes early, expecting perhaps a handful of curious neighbors might show up. By 7 o'clock, the small coffee shop was packed wall to wall with Saddleback Estates residents. The owner had to bring in extra chairs from storage as more people continued to arrive. I had no idea there was this much discontent in the neighborhood, James whispered to Eleanor as they surveyed the crowd. People have been waiting for someone to finally stand up to her, Eleanor replied. You become a symbol. Tom Jenkins approached with his wife, Sarah. That stunt you pulled at the meeting was the most entertaining thing I've seen in 3 years of HOA gatherings, he said, clapping James on the shoulder. Diane nearly had an aneurysm. We're here because she made us tear down our children's treehouse last summer, Sarah explained, claimed it violated the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood, even though it couldn't even be seen from the street. Similar stories emerged as James spoke with more residents. The Parkers had indeed been forced to repaint their entire house over a barely perceptible shade difference. The Gonzalez family had been fined daily for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. The Thompsons have fought a 6-month battle over unauthorized wind chimes on their back porch. Each story revealed Diane's obsessive micromanagement and selective enforcement of regulations. Rules that were strictly applied to those who questioned her were mysteriously flexible for her allies. She's created a surveillance state, muttered Henry Chen, who had been fined for leaving his garage door open for 30 minutes while unloading groceries. There's a network of concerned neighbors who report violations directly to her. Eleanor, ever the strategist, began organizing the chaotic energy in the room. Let's document every instance of selective enforcement or regulatory overreach. We need to build a pattern of behavior. As residents broke into small groups to compare notes, the cafe door swung open. A hush fell over the room as Raymond Halverson, Diane's husband, entered. Tall and imposing in an expensive suit, he surveyed the gathering with cold calculation. Unlike Diane's explosive temperament, Raymond was known for his icy precision. Quite the turnout, Morgan, he said, approaching James with an extended hand. Mind if we had a word in private? James exchanged glances with Eleanor, who gave a subtle nod. We can talk right here, James replied, deliberately not taking Raymond's hand. Raymond's smile didn't waver. Very well. I'll be direct. This unnecessary confrontation is causing my wife considerable distress. I'm prepared to offer you 20% above market value for your property with an expedited closing. You could be free of this whole situation within 30 days. The room had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching the exchange. Not interested, James said firmly. 30% then, Raymond countered smoothly, my final offer. Think carefully before you decline. The property isn't for sale at any price, James responded. It's been in my family for generations. Raymond's cordial demeanor cooled several degrees. Sentimentality is expensive, Mr. Morgan. If this annexation proceeds through official channels, you'll face years of regulatory compliance costs. The county has broad discretion in these matters, and we have significant influence with the commissioners. Is that a threat? Eleanor interjected. Merely a reality check, Raymond replied without looking at her. Diane can be zealous in her community oversight, but I assure you her methods are entirely legal. An older woman stood up from her seat. They weren't legal when she had my heritage roses removed while I was on vacation. The HOA bylaws require written notice before any landscape enforcement action. Or when she had my car towed from my own driveway for having out-of-state plates, added another resident. My daughter was visiting from college. Raymond's expression remained impassive, but James noticed a muscle twitching in his jaw as more residents began voicing their grievances. It seems you and your wife have united the neighborhood, Mr. Halverson, James observed, just not in the way you intended. Raymond straightened his already impeccable tie. This is a temporary setback. The annexation hearing will proceed regardless of this theatrical display of grievances. He lowered his voice. And remember, Morgan, Diane may be the face of this campaign, but I'm the one who ensures results. As Raymond turned to leave, James caught Eleanor's eye. They both recognized the shift. This was no longer just about Diane's rule enforcement obsession. The real power, and perhaps the greater threat, had just revealed itself. The morning after the cafe gathering, James woke to the sound of heavy machinery. He rushed outside to find 3 county vehicles parked at his property line and workers setting up equipment. What's going on here? He demanded, approaching a man who appeared to be supervising. Emergency water testing, the man replied, checking his clipboard. We received reports of possible contamination affecting the Saddleback Estate's water supply. That's impossible, James said. My well is completely separate from their system. The supervisor shrugged. Orders came directly from Commissioner Wilson's office. We need soil and water samples from your entire property, especially near the development border. James immediately called Eleanor, who arrived 30 minutes later with a court reporter in tow. This is harassment, Eleanor stated firmly to the supervisor while the court reporter documented everything. My client has received no formal notification of any water testing requirement. Ma'am, I'm just following orders, the supervisor replied uncomfortably. And we're just creating a record of those orders, Eleanor countered. Please provide copies of all testing protocols, chain of custody documentation, and the specific emergency declaration that authorized this action. As the supervisor scrambled to produce documentation he clearly didn't have, James spotted a familiar black Mercedes parked down the road. This time, both Diane and Raymond sat watching the proceedings. They're getting desperate, Eleanor murmured. Using the water quality angle is clever. It's one of the few emergency provisions that can bypass normal notification requirements. By mid-afternoon, the county workers departed with their samples, looking somewhat embarrassed by the excessive documentation Eleanor had insisted upon. The court reporter handed Eleanor a thick transcript of the entire interaction. Round one to us, Eleanor said with a tight smile. But they'll be back with something else. She wasn't wrong. Over the next 5 days, James faced a barrage of official harassment. Monday, Animal Control arrived to investigate an anonymous complaint about livestock welfare. Tuesday, a fire marshal appeared to inspect his barn for code violations. Wednesday, a zoning compliance officer measured the setbacks of every structure on his property. Thursday, environmental officials came to check for improper waste disposal. Friday, historical preservation assessors appeared, claiming his 1940s barn might qualify for protected status, which would prevent any development but also severely restrict his own use of the building. Each visit was meticulously documented by either Eleanor or the court reporter. Each official left without finding actionable violations, but the message was clear. The Halversons would use every bureaucratic weapon at their disposal. Meanwhile, the community resistance was growing. What had started as a single meeting at Riverside Cafe had evolved into an organized movement. Tom Jenkins created a private social media group for affected homeowners, which quickly grew to include over 60% of Saddleback Estates residents. On Saturday morning, James received an unexpected visitor. Sandra Chen, the county planner who had conducted the initial property assessment, stood nervously on his porch. I shouldn't be here, she said quietly after James invited her inside. But what's happening isn't right. She placed a manila folder on his kitchen table. These are internal communications about your case. Commissioner Wilson has fast-tracked everything at Raymond Halverson's request. They're golfing buddies. James leafed through the documents, his concern growing with each page. They've already drafted the annexation approval. Sandra nodded. The hearing is just for show. Wilson plans to approve it regardless of public comment. Why are you showing me this? James asked. Because I've seen this pattern before, Sandra replied. The Halversons did the same thing with phases 1 and 2. The people who refused to sell had their lives made miserable until they gave in. One family, the Mendozas, held out for months until their property was suddenly rezoned commercial. Their property taxes tripled overnight. James studied her face. You worked on those cases too. Sandra looked down. Yes, and I've regretted my silence ever since. This job was supposed to be about proper urban planning, not helping rich developers bully people out of their homes. After Sandra left, James called Eleanor with the new information. She arrived an hour later with grim determination. We need to change tactics, she said after reviewing the documents. Fighting this through normal channels won't work if the commissioner has already made his decision. #HOA Karen kept trespassing on my ranch road, so I dug a trench and let her SUV find the Saddleback Estates Community Center was filled beyond capacity for the emergency HOA meeting. Residents stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway, an unprecedented turnout that clearly caught Diane off guard. Her usual composure faltered momentarily as she surveyed the crowd from her elevated position at the board table. This emergency session will address recent activities undermining the stability and harmony of our community, Diane began, her voice tight with controlled anger. The board has become aware of unauthorized gatherings where false and damaging allegations against HOA leadership have been made. Raymond sat in the front row, his expression unreadable as he watched his wife. 2 uniformed security guards stood near the entrance, a first for any HOA meeting in Saddleback's history. Section 12.4 of our covenants allows for suspension of HOA privileges for members who engage in activities detrimental to community interests, Diane continued. The board proposes a 90-day suspension for the following homeowners. She began reading a list of names, essentially everyone who had attended the cafe meeting. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people realized the extent of the purge she was attempting. "Point of order," called a voice from the back of the room. Heads turned to see Eleanor standing beside James. Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is a closed meeting for homeowners only. Non-residents have no speaking privileges." "I'm here as legal counsel for multiple homeowners on your list," Eleanor replied, "and as such, I have standing to address procedural violations." Before Diane could respond, the rear doors of the community center swung open. A woman with a professional camera entered, followed by a man holding a microphone with the logo of the local news station. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Diane demanded, visibly flustered. "Jennifer Zhao, Channel 7 News," the woman announced. "We receive a tip about an emergency homeowners meeting with allegations of corruption and abuse of power. Would you care to comment, Mrs. Halverson?" The room fell silent. All eyes swung between the news crew and Diane, whose face had gone from flushed to ashen in seconds. "This is a private meeting," she stammered. "You have no right to be here." "Actually," Eleanor interjected, HOA bylaws section 4.2 specifically states that meetings must be open to the press if matters of public interest are being discussed. The proposed annexation of adjacent county lands certainly qualifies. James stepped forward, "And I invited them as my representatives since you're discussing my property without my input." The camera swung toward James as he spoke, capturing every word for the evening news. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, reading from a document, "Suspension of homeowner privileges requires documented evidence of specific bylaw violations, the formal hearing process for each affected member, and a supermajority board vote, none of which has occurred." The reporter moved closer to Diane, microphone extended. "Mrs. Halverson, residents have alleged that this emergency meeting was called specifically to silence opposition to a land development deal that would financially benefit you and your husband. Would you like to address these allegations?" Raymond stood abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced, though he had no official authority to do so. "No further comments." "One more question," the reporter persisted, turning toward Raymond. "Is it true that you've had private meetings with County Commissioner Wilson regarding the annexation hearing scheduled for next week?" Raymond's face hardened. "Any meetings I've had with the commissioner were in my capacity as a business leader in this community." "So you deny discussing James Morgan's property specifically?" she pressed. "No comment," Raymond replied curtly, moving to guide Diane toward a side exit. As they retreated, another resident stood up, the elderly woman who had spoken about her destroyed roses. "I have something to say," she announced in a wavering but determined voice. "I've lived here since before Saddleback Estates existed. This land was all family farms then. I've watched the Halversons push out family after family using these very same tactics." The camera swung to capture her testimony. "The Mendozas lost their home of 30 years. The Brickses were driven out by manufactured code violations. Now they're trying to do the same at James Morgan." Her voice strengthened. "I've been afraid to speak up until now, we all have, but not anymore." One by one, other residents began to stand and share their stories of intimidation and